He sat alone near the window, thin, quiet, barely touching his breakfast. On his wrist, a faded tattoo, a dagger crossed through an anchor. The men at the center table snickered. Probably drew that himself, one of them said. No vet eats alone without a badge. Another laughed. A waitress watched, frozen. The manager asked him to move outside, said he was making people uncomfortable. So he stood, balancing a tray, a cane, and what little dignity he had left. But then a young Navy SEAL walked in, saw the tattoo, and the entire diner fell silent. This is the story of what happened next, and why the town would never forget his name. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. Sunday morning had a rhythm of its own in Grant's Diner. By 8:30 a.m., the booths were filling fast, mostly with retirees, churchgoers, and a handful of regulars who didn't need menus. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee floated through the air, mixing with the quiet hum of laughter, forks on plates, and old country tunes trickling from a dusty speaker in the corner. It was Veterans Discount Day, half off for anyone with proof of service. Signs were taped on every window. A flag pin sat clipped to the hostess stand. One table had already stacked their empty plates and were chatting about old war stories that may or may not have ever happened. And in the back corner, right next to the exit sign, sat a thin man with snow-white hair, a brown coat worn too many winters, and a prosthetic leg made of dull metal peeking out beneath frayed jeans. His name was Walter Reed. He didn't wear medals. He didn't have a ball cap embroidered with units or wars. He hadn't spoken to anyone since he arrived, except to order the veterans' special scrambled eggs and toast. No substitutions. He sat alone. Always did. From where I stood behind the counter with a towel slung over my shoulder that could see the way he held his glass of water, both hands wrapped around it, as if steadying himself. But what caught most people's attention wasn't his silence. It was the tattoo. Faded and warped with age, it rested on his left wrist. A dagger crossed through an anchor. Nothing fancy, barely legible. The kind of ink people used to get in barracks bathrooms, back before the digital world came along to document everything. A group of 4 men, late 40s, loud, all wearing matching golf jackets, were seated at the center booth. They noticed him right away. One of them nudged the others, nodding toward Walter's table. I bet he drew that thing on himself. He snickered. Looks like a middle school dare. Another leaned in, smirking. What kind of vet doesn't even have a service ID? They laughed. Not loud, but loud enough. I froze at my station. I didn't know Walter's story. None of us did. He came in every year on this day, sat in the same spot, ordered the same meal, said thank you, left $1 on the table, and disappeared. He never made a fuss. And maybe that's why it hurt to watch him become the butt of someone else's joke. I wasn't the only one who heard them. Walter didn't flinch, didn't even lift his head, just kept his eyes on his glass. The corners of his mouth tight with something you couldn't quite name. Not shame, not sadness, something heavier. Then the manager walked over. Todd, clipboard under one arm, customer service smile plastered on like stage makeup. He bent toward Walter's table. Sir, he said, voice polite but firm. We've had a couple of complaints. Some of the other guests feel uncomfortable. Would you mind relocating to the patio seating? The room didn't go quiet, but something changed in the air. I stopped wiping the counter. Walter said nothing. He just gave the slightest nod. Not out of agreement, out of resignation. The kind of nod you give when you've had this conversation before too many times. He gathered his tray, balancing it in one hand while gripping a cane with the other. His walk was slow, each step a negotiation between pain and pride. The prosthetic leg creaked with every movement. As he passed the center table, one of the men raised his coffee mug and said loudly, "If he's a SEAL, I must be the president." The table roared, and that's when it happened. A single tear rolled down Walter's cheek and dropped to the tile floor. Nobody said anything. Nobody stopped him. I looked at Todd. He didn't move, just turned away like he had tables to check. Walter made it to the glass door, struggled with the handle, and stepped out into the cold light of late autumn. The wind hit him in the face. He squinted, scanning the empty patio before settling at a table near the edge. One hand still on his cane, the other setting down a plate of now cold eggs. Back inside, the air returned to its artificial comfort. Customers sipped their refills. The men at the center table laughed again, softer now, but still smug. I didn't know what to do. I was new, still in high school. They told me to smile, refill coffee, and stay out of customer disputes. But something about that man, something about the way he took the humiliation like it was routine, it made my throat ache. I kept glancing toward the window. Walter sat alone, shoulders hunched slightly, steam rising from his coffee only because of the cold wind around him. A veteran, clearly, but with no fanfare, no documentation, no defense. He wasn't invisible. People saw him. They just chose not to look. Then at 8:46 a.m., the bell over the door jingled, and a young man stepped inside. Black jacket, tight haircut, military straight posture, maybe late 20s. No smile, no hesitation, just a quiet kind of presence that made people step out of his way without realizing they had. He scanned the room, and then his eyes locked on the empty seat where Walter had been. Then to the window. Then to the tattoo still visible, still unmistakable, resting against the old man's wrist as he steadied his fork. And the young man stopped cold, his jaw tightened, his breath caught, and the entire room fell silent, like someone had unplugged the jukebox, like every fork in the place had frozen halfway to someone's mouth. Because this young soldier wasn't just looking, he was recognizing. And what he saw on that old man's wrist wasn't just a faded tattoo. It was history. It was brotherhood. It was a story only some men were ever meant to know. And he was about to tell all of us. Jackson Miles didn't move. Not at first. His boots remained planted just inside the entrance of Grant's Diner, like gravity had grabbed hold of him and wouldn't let go. His eyes sharp, trained, relentless, were fixed on that tattoo, the one on the old man's wrist, the dagger through the anchor. The emblem no ordinary sailor would know. It wasn't official Navy issue. It never showed up on recruitment posters or regulation uniforms. It belonged to a unit so specialized. Most files about them were still redacted after 50 years, and only 8 men ever wore that mark. Jackson took a slow step forward, then another. The buzz of conversation that had filled the diner minutes ago had vanished. Even the coffee machine hissed a little quieter. All eyes followed the young man in uniform as he walked past the booths, past the counter, past the table of 4 who'd done all the mocking. When he reached the window and looked outside, the wind caught the door for a second. It slammed shut behind him, and everyone jumped. I watched from behind the counter, heart hammering. Walter Reed hadn't noticed him yet. He was still sitting at the edge of the patio, one hand on his cane, the other on his plate. The eggs were untouched. His shoulders curved forward, hunched like someone who'd learned to make himself smaller just to survive the room. Jackson opened the door to the patio and stepped out. He stopped 2 feet from the table. Then he stood tall, straight-backed, squared shoulders, and raised his hand in a perfect salute. "Sir," he said loud enough for everyone inside to hear, "are you Walter Reed of SEAL Team Bravo?" Walter looked up slowly, confused. The wind caught the edge of his coat and lifted it just enough to reveal the full tattoo. Jackson's voice cracked just slightly when he spoke again. "G7, isn't it, sir? You're the one they tell us about in training." Walter blinked, stunned. His lips parted, but no words came out. His hand tightened around his cane. Then, finally, he nodded. Jackson didn't lower his salute. His voice dropped, but it still carried. Permission to sit. Sir Walter motioned to the chair across from him. "Of course, son." Jackson lowered his arm and sat, still stiff, still trembling in awe. Inside the diner, no one moved. Not the servers, not the guests, not even the 4 men at the center booth, whose earlier laughter had now turned into pale, awkward silence. Todd, the manager, stood halfway between the counter and the register, his face drained of color. And me, I was frozen in place, heart thudding in my chest because I'd heard that name before. Walter Reed in G7. That wasn't just a nickname. It was a code designation, passed around SEAL training camps like a whispered legend. The man who once coordinated extractions under fire with no radio contact. The logistics technician who saved 17 lives during Operation Swift Current. The one whose records were still classified because no one could figure out how he'd pulled it off. I only knew because of my grandfather, James Harrington. He used to tell me bedtime stories that didn't feel like stories until I was old enough to realize they were memories. And in every one of them, there was a quiet man with a wrist tattoo who never said much but always got them home. I never thought I'd see him in real life. But here he was, right outside the window, with rain threatening again in the distance and a soldier sitting across from him like he was meeting royalty. Jackson turned slightly in his seat, his voice still audible to all of us inside. This man, he said, designed extraction protocols we still use today. He helped build our standard operating procedures for field supply drops. That tattoo, it was earned in blood, not bought, not claimed. He looked at the center table. If anyone here feels uncomfortable in the presence of a living legend, he said firmly, maybe you should be the ones eating outside. One of the men shifted in his seat. Another cleared his throat and stood up, leaving his plate half-eaten. Then another followed. By the time Jackson turned back toward Walter, only two of them remained and their eyes were locked on their coffee mugs, burning with shame. Walter didn't say much. He never did. But his lips pressed together in a line that almost resembled a smile, the kind of smile that carried 50 years of silence. I don't remember making the decision to move, but suddenly I was at the door, stepping outside with a fresh pot of coffee in my hand. I poured a cup for Walter without a word. Then I looked at Jackson. Would you like some too? Yes, ma'am, he said softly. Thank you. He took it with both hands, like it was something sacred. I stood there for a moment, not knowing what to say. Then I did something I never planned to do. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I'd kept it there since this morning, one of the old notes my grandfather had written in his field journal. A photo had been tucked inside. It showed two young men in jungle gear, standing near a rusted truck, grinning like fools. One of them was Grandpa James. The other had a dagger and anchor tattoo. I unfolded the photo and set it down on the table in front of Walter. He froze. His eyes scanned the image. Then he lifted his gaze to me, and for a moment, just a moment, his whole face shifted, like he'd recognized something he hadn't seen in years. What was your grandfather's name? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. James Harrington. I replied, and Walter blinked. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled. He promised me once he'd buy the first burger when we got home. I smiled gently. He talked about you. He always said you were the reason they made it back. Walter looked at the photo again, then at me. You have his eyes. A lump rose in my throat. Jackson said nothing, just watched us quietly. He knew this wasn't a moment to interrupt. And then without asking, without warning, he stood up and raised his phone. He snapped a single photo. Walter, the tattoo, the coffee, the folded photo on the table, me standing beside him, just a quiet scene on a quiet Sunday morning in a nowhere town. But Jackson knew what he was doing. By that night, the image would be everywhere. Millions of people would see it. Some would share it. Some would cry. Some would ask how they'd never heard of Walter Reed before. And maybe for the first time in half a century, the world would finally see what it almost forgot. Not just the man, but what he stood for. By Monday morning, the photo had gone viral, not because of fancy editing, not because it was staged, because it was real. Because someone somewhere saw a young Navy SEAL saluting an old man with a faded tattoo, a coffee cup between them, a folded photograph, a girl in an apron standing nearby with tears in her eyes. The caption was simple. Some heroes don't wear uniforms anymore. Some still carry the mission. I didn't even know Jackson had posted it. He hadn't told anyone. But the internet moved fast. Faster than memory, faster than shame, faster than people could explain how they'd missed it for so long. Walter Reed became a name again. Local news picked it up first, then regional. By Wednesday, There were camera crews outside Grant's diner, asking for interviews. Todd, the same manager who'd asked Walter to sit outside, dodged questions like he was allergic to accountability. But me, I talked. I told them what I saw, what I felt, what I'd nearly stayed silent about. And when they asked who Walter Reed was, I didn't quote his rank or his war record. I just said, he's the kind of man who never asks for anything and deserves everything. The rest, as they say, unfolded on its own. Letters started arriving by Friday. At first, just a few, handwritten, mostly from veterans, mostly from people who said things like, I served in Nam. I remember G7 stories. I thought they were legend. My dad told me about a man who pulled 3 soldiers from a burning truck. I think that was your Walter. Then came the school children. Dozens of envelopes, all sealed with Scotch tape and crooked handwriting. Crayon drawings of a smiling old man with a tattoo on his wrist. One read, Dear Mr. Reed, my grandpa cried when he saw your picture. He said you were the reason he came home. Walter didn't know what to do with them at first. He brought a stack into the diner and handed them to me. Said, you'll know what to do. I made copies, framed a few, posted one on the bulletin board with a note. If you know Walter, say thank you. The next day, a woman left flowers outside the patio table he used to sit at. No card, just a single daisy and a napkin that said, we see you now. 2 weeks later, I got a call from City Hall. They wanted Walter to speak at the Veterans Day ceremony. Said it'd mean a lot if someone like him, someone who represented silent service, could offer a few words. I called him that night. He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, if it helps others feel remembered, I'll go. That Sunday, I stood at the back of the community auditorium, watching him walk up the steps to the podium. No uniform, no medals, just a clean button-down shirt, his prosthetic polished, and that tattoo still visible beneath the rolled sleeve of his left arm. He stood behind the mic, looked out at the packed room, and said only this, I'm not a hero, I'm not a legend. I just did the right thing and tried to live quiet after. But if what I did helped someone, then I'd do it again tomorrow. That was it. He stepped back, and the entire room rose to its feet, not because the speech was long, not because it was eloquent, because it was true. And truth carries weight. After that day, something shifted in our town. You could feel it in little things. People started waving to Walter on the street. Kids ran up to him outside the post office, asking about his tattoo. Churches invited him to speak, not to preach, just to share. The auto shop he'd quietly run for 20 years, barely scraping by, suddenly had a waiting list. One morning, a group of volunteers from the high school showed up with paint buckets and ladders. They said, we're here to clean up the place, sir. Walter grumbled. But let them. The next week, someone replaced the squeaky gate out front. Then someone fixed the roof. Then a couple of veterans stopped by with brand new tools and said, thought you could use these. And Walter, he didn't ask for any of it. He just smiled, let them help, and got back to work. Because that's who he was. In late spring, the mayor made an announcement. They were installing a plaque at City Hall, a permanent marker right beside the American flag. It bore a simple engraving, honor the quiet ones, the ones who carried burdens we never saw, the ones who walked alone so others could come home. At the bottom, etched into steel, was the tattoo, a dagger through an anchor. Walter stood beside it during the unveiling. No speech this time. He just touched the metal gently and nodded. His eyes were wet, but no tears fell. They didn't need to. And then came the day we didn't expect. Walter's 85th birthday. It was quiet. He didn't want a party. Said he'd be fine with black coffee and toast like always. But life had other plans. That morning, just before 9 a.m., I heard it, a low hum in the distance, then tires crunching on gravel. I stepped out of the diner just in time to see 3 black SUVs pull up in front of the auto shop. And behind them 2 Humvees. 7 young men stepped out, sharp haircuts, polished boots, crisp navy dress uniforms. And then one more figure emerged from the back seat of the last SUV, Sarah Harrington, my cousin, my best friend, and the granddaughter of James Harrington. She was holding a small wooden box and a folded American flag. Walter stepped out of the shop, wiping his hands with a rag, his brow furrowed in confusion. Until he saw them, until he saw her. Sarah stepped forward first. "Hi," she said, voice trembling. "You probably don't remember me." Walter blinked. "I do," he said. "You have your grandfather's eyes." She smiled, eyes already filling. "We came to honor your birthday," she said, "and to say thank you." Walter looked at the men behind her. One by one, they approached. Each stood at attention, each saluted, and then without fanfare, without speeches, they handed him that small wooden box. Inside was a medallion from the Navy SEAL Historical Foundation, engraved with his name, his designation, and below that, for service above silence. He didn't say much, just whispered, "I thought they'd forgotten." Sarah took his hand. We never did. Walter stood still, holding the medallion in both hands, his thumbs brushing over the engraved words. The wind rustled gently through the trees above, and for a moment, everything around us seemed to slow. No cars passed, no phones rang, no one said a word. The 7 young SEALs stood silently behind Sarah, their uniforms immaculate, eyes sharp. But even they looked humbled, like they knew this wasn't just another ceremony. This was something deeper, quieter, sacred. Sarah stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "He would have been proud. You know." Walter looked up, eyes searching hers. She smiled softly, fighting the tears rising in her throat. "My grandfather, James Harrington, he would have been proud to know I got to meet you, to stand here and say thank you, not just for him, but for all of us." Walter blinked, slowly, then reached out and gently took her hand. "He was the best of us," he said. Sarah nodded. "So were you." The old man's eyes glistened, and for a second, he looked not 85, but 25. Young again, back in the jungle, back in the fire, back when 8 men carried a promise that only one had lived long enough to keep. And now he wasn't carrying it alone anymore. That week, something changed in town. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It started with a proposal from the city council brought forward by the mayor herself, a motion to rename the road where Walter's auto shop stood. Not after a politician, not after a developer, but after a man who never asked for his name to be known. 3 weeks later, a new sign was unveiled. White letters, simple metal post. Nothing flashy. It read, "Silent Service Way in honor of Walter Reed, SEAL Team Bravo. Honor the quiet ones." They didn't hold a ribbon cutting. Walter wouldn't have liked that. Instead, they planted a small American flag beneath the sign and left it at that. Walter kept working at the shop after that. Slower than before, but still steady, still methodical. Neighbors stopped by more often, not just for tune-ups, but to sit, to listen, to learn. Kids brought drawings. Veterans brought old photos. He didn't talk much, never liked the spotlight. But sometimes, if you caught him on a quiet afternoon, he'd tell you about the time a medevac was 3 minutes late, and how he carried a man on his back across a field full of silence and smoke. He never called it heroism. He just called it finishing the job. That's how Walter lived, until the day he didn't. 3 years later, on a crisp morning in late September, the flags at City Hall were lowered to half-staff. Walter Reed passed in his sleep. No pain, no noise, just silence. Like always, the town went still that day. The diner closed early. The high school canceled its afternoon classes. And by noon, people had already begun gathering outside the small church on the edge of town, the one with peeling white paint and a steeple that leaned ever so slightly to the left. They came in work boots and military dress, in baseball caps and choir robes, in old uniforms that hadn't been buttoned in decades. They came because they knew what he'd carried, even if he never said it out loud. The funeral was simple, dignified, a wooden casket draped in the American flag. At Walter's request, there were no eulogies, no slideshow, no biographies read, just one song, played slow and low, like it had to tiptoe across the room. 6 active duty SEALs, including Jackson Miles, carried the casket. Each one had flown in from different corners of the country, not because they had to, but because when a man like Walter goes home, you show up. Sarah Harrington sat in the front pew, her hands clutched around a folded photograph, the one of Walter and her grandfather, taken before their final mission. At the gravesite, she walked forward and laid it gently against the polished wood. She whispered, "You kept the promise for both of you." On the headstone, beneath Walter Reed's name and the years of his life, the town inscribed a single line. He didn't ask for it. They just knew. His silence spoke volumes. His service changed lives. The diner still serves the Veterans Special every Sunday, but now the corner table stays empty. A small brass plaque is bolted to the wood. It says "Reserved, in memory of Walter Reed, SEAL Team Bravo G7." Some men carry the mission long after the war ends. Tourists sometimes ask who he was. Locals just point to the sign outside and smile. Silent service way. Because around here, some stories aren't shouted, they're carried. One quiet act at a time, one quiet man at a time, until the whole town remembers. And maybe, just maybe the rest of us do too. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.